From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We begin today's program with Elaine Johannes, the Kansas Health Foundation's Distinguished Professor of Community Health at Kansas State, with the impact that drought and climate anxiety can have on our health. Then Brian Olson and Bob Weaber, department heads of Kansas Research and Extension Centers, discuss what each center brings to Kansas agriculture and Kansas Extension. And for this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast segment, the team answers a question about weaning calves from large grazing allotments. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Drought is one of the most persistent and psychologically demanding stressors for agricultural producers. The Kansas Health Foundation's Distinguished Professor of Community Health at Kansas State University, Elaine Johannes, says that when any climate-related stressor becomes long-term, they can become a chronic anxiety which can affect our health. Elaine, you've had an opportunity recently to really learn a lot about drought and water and all sorts of things that really come into play here, especially in the state of Kansas. We deal with that in all parts of the state, but it's not always just dependent on rainfall, is it? There's a lot of things that go into why a drought may occur.
Yes. Just to admit, your listeners need to know that I'm not a hydrologist, meaning I'm not a water expert. I'm not a meteorologist, meaning a weather expert. But I've had the privilege of working with many of our extension faculty and professionals across the southwest part of the state to understand what's going on there related to water management, water drought, and how we conserve water resources in that part of the state, but actually the whole part of the western part of Kansas that relies on the aquifer, the Ogallala. So I've learned a lot. I have the privilege of serving some of that mental health, stress reduction, anxiety reduction work, and learning a lot about what happens when water resources are depleted, as well as we've got weather drought.
In terms of just conservation, there's a lot of things we can do. There are some things that we obviously don't have control over. And is that where a lot of the stress comes in?
Yes. As I have understood, there are different kinds of drought. There's meteorologic drought, meaning it didn't rain. Maybe that's more of a short-term kind of concern. But that itself creates stress. But then we think about what is also a hydrological drought. And I think our producers are aware of that. When you don't have enough resources in the subground, the subterranean, the aquifer, and that's persistent. And that then comes into an agricultural drought. The producers don't have enough moisture, let alone water resources to irrigate, to keep the cattle, to keep things going, so your economic drought doesn't occur. And so when I've observed our Southwest region, all the professionals there working along with the collaborators, we could be saying that we're in an economic drought that is part of a hydrological, potentially that meteorological, because if we don't have rain, because climate change is hitting, I think we're all aware that there are some things that are persistent and long-term. And when they become long-term, then that occasional stress can become a chronic anxiety. And when we become anxious over time and it's chronic, then sometimes our health, we become less likely to sleep well. We become less likely to eat well, to actually engage in relationships, being connected to the community. It can create some mental health issues for longer term. And researchers and clinicians, and I'm not a mental health therapist, I'm not a clinician, but there is a body of literature now. There is a specialist area of what's called climate psychology. And climate psychology helps communities, populations, families, and individuals figure out how do we cope when our environment changes and when our livelihoods that has relied on having access to water, when we change up our whole, how we see ourselves. And Jeff, there is a phenomena, there's maybe a behavior or a feeling that maybe your listeners have had where we grieve the fact that the land has changed. And it's called solastalgic. When we think about if we're nostalgic, we're kind of mournful and we kind of, are sorry that the places that we were when we were kids are gone. Well, solastalgic means the actual physical environment that we remember, that we feel connected to, that we remember where the trees were, or we remember how the prairie once looked. That is grief. And I know that some of the research that's coming out of federal systems and many other groups are finding that we as Americans are starting to feel some grief around how the terrain and how our environment is looking. And that grief, if it's persistent and we see no way of changing it, that can really affect our mental health for the long term.
I think what I find interesting is the fact that the drought impact on agriculture is not necessarily, as we normally think, crops. There's also the personal impact.
Yes, yeah. When we think about people who their livelihoods, their purpose in life from long term, the generational farm, the operation, and they see themselves as not being able to be as productive. And it's not because of poor management. It's the environment has changed. The context of having access to the water resources changed. The management is important. We can't ignore that. But I do see our colleagues out in the state trying to understand, how do we manage our identity different? How do we manage this chronic stress and anxiety? How do we work as a community, not only in production agriculture, but my goodness, the cities, the towns, the people that support and rely on the rural economy. The whole state relies on the rural agricultural economy. So it is an issue that I think we as Kansans can rally around to understand and then work together to conserve as much as we can. Some of the psychology, psychiatric, mental health practitioners and the studies that are coming out are really focusing on what's called meaningful focused coping. And meaningful focused coping means we're coping, but our actions and our behaviors and our efforts have meaning to them. They have meaning because I identify with what I'm doing. It's meaningful because my purpose is associated with the environment. It's associated with the land. It's associated with how the water is utilized and kept and preserved at times. But meaningful, focused coping really gets to what I think Extension is doing out in the Southwest and Northwest now through the 40-gallon challenge. These are activities that can actually bring people together for meaningful engagement, talking about it. How do you conserve? How do you preserve? And that builds community, and that builds some reduction in anxiety and then hope.
And it also makes you feel like you're making a difference, that you're taking some action. Maybe it's just fixing a leak, but that's having an impact.
Yes, yeah. What I'm really excited by, and I'm so glad that our agent out in the Ulysses, Kansas area, she's Grant County and Gray County, and we've got all the counties down in that part of the state. Monica Walker is the person that brought the 40-gallon challenge to K-State Extension. And it has a really nice connection to working with youth. If a family says, okay, we're going to try to conserve and we're going to adjust how we take a shower. We may take 2 minutes off of that shower today. We may not run the dishwasher unless it's full, but we'll also maybe not, water the yard all the time. These are community level activities. There are agricultural and large management activities as the state of Kansas is involved with and regional. But from our own homes and households, we can take this up and we can actually model to the children in our households. It shows that adults can be thoughtful. We can lead a family to conserve and talk about it. And actually, meaningful, focused coping is best when you share it, when you talk it up, when you know that your whole neighborhood maybe is involved, or your 4-H club, even your sports team. I think the more we get the 40-gallon challenge discussed, I think people will feel like, well, we can take action. We don't have to be anxious alone. We can start understanding what's happening with these droughts. And maybe we had rain today, but let's think about what's under the soil and where we actually pull our water from. And what does it mean when we see the world around us changing?
And when we make these a habit, then when we get that rain, we don't go back to using more water. Yeah. We're still conserving even when things are good.
Yeah. We understand then that we are part of the environment, and the environment is part of our livelihoods and part of how we work as a society. The concept of One Health is really something I think all of us can kind of get our hands around. One Health is not just around agricultural health. Yes, it is environment, it's animal health, and it is human health. And when we think about One Health being a comprehensive view of how we live in our communities and how we engage in our businesses, how we look at our livelihoods, it is animal, human, and environment together. And we find ourselves at a time where we need to recognize that because the environment's affecting us. This is not just a short-term issue. Drought, lack of water, lack of actually having a long-term solution, we can cope and we can adapt. And so giving us time to understand our coping and how we can preserve what the environment has for us and then adapting to it. That's what I think the 40-gallon challenge kicks off for us, a chance to understand, to work together, and to see that we can make a difference as long as we're working together on things.
That's the Kansas Health Foundation's Distinguished Professor of Community Health at Kansas State University, Elaine Johannes. She says that Extension's 40-gallon challenge is being piloted in Ford, Grant, Greeley, Meade, Morton, Stanton, and Thomas counties, along with the West Plains District, which includes Finney and Scott counties, and the Wild West District, which serves Stevens, Seward, and Haskell counties. This is the K-State Radio Network.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about K-State's research and extension centers with two heads of Kansas Research and Extension Centers, Brian Olson, who's in Western Kansas, and Bob Weber, who's in Eastern Kansas. Brian, Bob, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby. We look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Bob, oftentimes when we think about K-State, we think about Manhattan. However, these extension centers, something also really important to K-State. And so can you explain to us, what are they?
Sure. So we've got a range of outstate or off-campus locations. I like outstate because it's still really part of campus, but it's our extension into the communities around the state that we serve. And the centers really are a mixture of both typically research and extension faculty, or people that have split appointments between those two mission areas. We have a few faculty that do a little bit of instructional work, either online courses or reach back to campus. But most of the focus is on research and innovation, so new science and discovery work in a variety of mission areas. And then delivering that information out into the communities where it's useful.
Are you really able to then do specialized work in your different locations for something that really benefits that community or that specialization of agriculture?
Yeah, so I'll use one of the centers that I oversee, the Southeast Research and Extension Center at Parsons, Kansas. So it's got locations at Parsons, Mound Valley, and Columbus in that complex. And agriculture in that part of the state, due to the substantially different rainfall, say, than Colby, Kansas in Northwest, more than double the rainfall in Parsons versus Colby, maybe triple. We're about 45 inches typically. I think Colby's probably, 14, 15, somewhere in there, Dr. Olson.
Some 20.
Yeah, so we're predominantly rain-fed cropping systems and livestock to go with that. So fall calving cows versus spring calving cows. And so it does let us do some real regional adaptation to our work and make sure that it works in those production settings versus, say, something that may be discovered in a spring calving herd or a cropping system that's in a more arid environment. So it does really let us customize and meet the unique needs of people in different geographic areas of our state.
You mentioned 3 centers. Where are all of these centers around the state?
Sure. So I'll cover the ones in the east real quick. So we've got the Southeast Center, which is, again, that complex of Parsons, Columbus, Mound Valley headquarters facilities right in Parsons. That one's largely centered around 4 mission areas. So crops and livestock would be our kind of operations components. but we also have family and consumer science and youth development faculty stationed there. So we cover a pretty broad set of mission areas. Two horticulture facilities in my department, one on the outskirts of Olathe, Kansas, so near the Kansas City metro area, actually just adjacent to the Sunflower Munitions facility that's over there. And then another horticulture facility at Hayesville, just on the southeast side of Wichita. And then we've got some faculty embedded in what we call the Northeast Area Office, which is a sort of a dispersed set of faculty in Manhattan on campus.
So then as for Western Kansas, we've got 4 main locations: Hayes, Garden City, Colby, and Tribune. We do have some outlying satellite sites such as the HB Ranch or the Lonsinger Sustainability Farm up around Osborne. But we've got 20 faculty in the Western Kansas department. Back to what Bob was saying, there's many different disciplines. So we go from family consumer science 4-H to ag engineering to ag economics, animal science, and agronomy. So it's really pretty unique when we have such a multidisciplinary team that we can look at how can we set up the research that will answer questions for producers and for families in this area, but then also looking at how we can extend that information out back to the different disciplines that are represented. So unique opportunities for sure when we look at research and engagement and really addressing the needs of folks in the areas that we're at. And so the value of these extension centers is really understanding the concerns, the problems that different groups have in this area. So obviously out west, we've got a concern on water. We've got the Ogallala Aquifer discussion. And so we're doing a lot of research looking at how we can put production systems together across multiple years, looking at crop rotation in order to help producers be economically viable, but also turn around and support the beef industry, which is very predominant in our area.
What is it like then having new faculty or new students come into these centers and get them used to the environment of these centers?
So as a department head, I think you've got the unique opportunity to help a new assistant professor or a new faculty member transition from being a graduate student into being a faculty member and leading their team, right? So you want to empower them to go out there and, secure funding, to provide leadership, but it takes a little coaching because it just doesn't happen automatically. When you walk out the stage with your PhD, it's like, oh, well, now I'm going to go be a leader. No, there's a transition there. So understanding, help them understand what it takes back to managing a team. So many of them were part of a team, but then now they are in that leadership role of managing, let's say, an ag tech or an animal tech, and they've got some graduate students themselves. There's that coaching aspect. So I enjoy that. And then also bringing folks in from who maybe are from outside the area and letting them experience the area that we have our centers at. There's also some challenges there, right? So I did have one of our professors talk about rainfall because we did have a wet June. I was like, don't talk about that too much because the rain will stop. And it sure did. So we're sitting a little bit drier than we'd like to right now.
I'll echo, Brian's comment. The new faculty mentorship, I think, is really an enjoyable experience as an administrator. Help coach somebody into what can be a fairly challenging environment, right? So we think about the university. It's our university, in particular, K-State, a very family is something that really resonates with a lot of people that have gone to K-State or in the community at K-State. But sorting out, how does the financial system work? How does accounting work? How does HR work? And so, part of Brian and I's jobs as sort of the lead administrators is to not only coach our staff that are working directly in those spaces, but, how to get young faculty engaged and on the right path so that they don't get derailed by something that they didn't foresee. Because it is a pretty big machine, if you will. And there's certainly some potential pitfalls if you don't navigate it right. And so we want to make sure we get our young faculty pointed the right way. And like Brian, I think one of the most rewarding bits is to see, the communities that come together and interface with our faculty. I had last week a turf grass field day down at the Hayesville location, John C. Pear Sport and Research Extension Center. and just close to 300 attendees that were mostly from the commercial landscape and horticulture space. So folks that, superintendents at golf courses and cemeteries and parks and rec and all those groups came together for a day of really impactful programming. And I'm not a turf grass guy, so I learned a ton about, managing turf grass in Northeast Kansas, but also just fun to engage with those folks. Many of them K-State grads. I met a gentleman from over at Olathe, standing invite now to come by and we'll have lunch or something when I get over by the Hort station at Olathe. But we're about the same vintage, so we had stories about his time at K-State as an undergraduate, and it's just really fun to make those connections and see the impact that K-State has in both research and extension, and certainly our undergraduate and graduate teaching missions in the lives of people in Kansas and beyond, right? There are people out of state that came to the field day. So I think that part's really rewarding to see a lot of the background work. Sometimes we don't get to see what the deployed product is. Field days are a great example of that, and really an enjoyable experience and rewarding as an administrator to see the success that our faculty are having out state.
From both of your roles in the research and extension centers, what's your favorite part?
So again, back to helping young faculty. I just can't stress that enough. You're taking somebody at the very start of their career, and you are giving them helping them build the foundation to be successful for many years to come. And seeing the growth, there's a lot of growth that occurs in the first couple years, and that's extremely rewarding.
Yeah, I think that part that Brian just said is important for me as well. I think the other thing, and neither Brian or I have hit on this yet, but our faculty at the outlying stations also have a mentorship and coaching role of their own. And so they provide kind of our frontline service to the district and county agents around the state in that same way, right? And so we can see the actions and results of our faculty's work helping coach and mentor those folks in delivery of extension programs and skill set development, and that's pretty cool to see.
What is the best way for people to find more information about these centers if they'd like to?
Yeah, so we've got a nice website. It's wkrec.org. So we've got field days coming up. We've got other events. Please log on and see what we've got.
Yeah, and for Eastern Kansas, just Google ECREC, so Eastern Kansas Research and Extension Centers, EKREC, and it'll come up right on top of the list. So,
Bob, Brian, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you, Shelby.
So much.
Those were department heads of the Kansas Research and Extension Centers, with Brian Olson being from Western Kansas and Bob Weber being in Eastern Kansas. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. We end today's program with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast as Brad White, Bob Larson, Philip Lancaster, Todd Gunderson, and Eduardo Bortoluzzi answer a question about weaning calves from large grazing allotments where producers have limited opportunities to handle animals before weaning.
Todd, you received a question the other day that I thought would be interesting for the group to talk about because it's got some constraints that make it not just a stock answer.
Yeah, that's right. A good friend, colleague of mine, Dr. Chase Staker, called me up from Idaho the other day, and we had a conversation about weaning protocols for calves and beef cow-calf operations. And if I have a constraint where I really can't do a lot with these calves prior to weaning, the example he gave me was I've got calves out on a big Forest Service or BLM allotment during the summer, so I really can't do much with them until the day I wean them. What are some of the better protocols for handling those calves? Do I want to give them a vaccine on the day I wean them when I bring them down from the mountains or from the summer pasture, wherever that is? Do I want to wait a couple of weeks and then give them their vaccines? Do I want to use some type of a metaphylactic drug if I feel like these calves are at risk for disease? And then we talked a little bit about some pulse feeding strategies for using chlorotetracycline in a pulse feeding protocol to control respiratory disease.
That's a good question. I would go back to how has weaning gone in the past? Are they seeing breaks of respiratory disease shortly after weaning or not? The other thing is pay attention to what the weather forecast is going to be and delay weaning until you've got a period of at least what the weatherman says is going to be some good weather so that I can take some of that stress out. Because that can be a pretty significant stress and decrease their feed intake. And you don't have to wean when you thought you were going to if there's some really inclement weather coming. So I could be talked into either vaccinating right at weaning or delaying it a little bit based on, again, kind of the timing of when they've seen outbreaks in the past. If they're seeing some respiratory disease pretty soon, but I'm not convinced that a vaccine at weaning may not impact that because of the time lag, I would look at why are we seeing a respiratory disease outbreak near weaning. And so then things like getting them up on a diet where they're getting sufficient protein. Again, the other stressors, the environment of the pasture or pen that they're being weaned into. So I'm not going to prevent respiratory disease only with vaccines. I'm really trying to look at the system as much as I can.
One thing I had thought of, probably in his situation, some other low-stress weaning techniques like fence line weaning, instead of abrupt weaning where they still have some contact on a strong fence, could help reduce some stress on those calves, and maybe that would help reduce some of his incidence of respiratory disease.
Or even on, and I would modify a little bit, I like the low-stress weaning, and sometimes it takes a change in mindset, because even if it's not a perfectly strong fence and not all of them stay weaned, then you have some get back, and then you eventually get them all weaned, but you get more of the group. But it's hard when you're coming off those big pastures, big range. But I agree with what you guys are saying. Manage the stress, manage the start plan into the new environment. How much of the new environment can we get them used to before we get them there? Water, feed, that sort of thing.
Does he have to wean them as soon as they come down off of the Forest Service land, or does he have a place where he can keep them together for a little while after he brings them down out of the forest land?
That's kind of my question. Could you modify that? Like cows they're coming down. The cows obviously have some sort of winter range. Can they stay together on winter range for a little bit of time to get them used to, because you're essentially commingling coming off of a big BLM forest situation. If you can bring them together and let them hang out on winter range for a couple weeks and then wean, could you do some sort of hybrid model like that?
What other thoughts have you guys had?
I think there's a lot of combinations of stressors at weaning that it's not only weaning, right? Because you're separating them. They need to learn to eat from bunk. Sometimes they are transport right away. So the only concern I have about vaccinating at that time is how much of that is going to be effective with the amount of stressors they're going through. So I guess, again, depends on the situation on how you're going to decide if you're going to vaccinate at that time or if you're going to wait a little bit to vaccinate, on what other stressors you're adding to the weaning stressor.
That's the BCI staff answer to a question on the August 14th podcast. To listen to the podcast, do an online search for BCI Cattle Chat Podcast. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.